after 10 p.m. tonight. That is coming your way on In Focus. Oli, standing by with that chat. Over to you.
Thabo, thank you very much. Let's get into that conversation. South Africa is in uncharted territory after the ANC lost its national majority in last week's vote for the first time since the dawn of democracy. Political parties are now holding talks to form a coalition government. Let's speak about this now with Roelf Meyer, who was part of the negotiating team of the country's first transition from apartheid to democracy. Mr. Meyer, good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time. I'd like to start off this conversation with the question, in your own words, describe this moment that South Africa finds itself in right now.
Well, thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation with you. It reminds one undoubtedly, in my personal case, of where we were 30 years ago. A major transition at that time from the apartheid state to democracy, and it was led in by a new government, which was called the Government of National Unity. And now we have almost a similar moment, of course, not from apartheid, but from a situation where we had one ruling party for 6 administrations. And now come the 7th administration of the Democratic South Africa, and is going to be led by a multiplicity, it seems, of parties. So it's a different stage of our democracy that we're reaching. And in my personal feeling, an exciting moment, because I don't think South Africans were really prepared, even when they went to the polls, for what the consequences were going to be. It means, in my mind, that we have a major step forward at our doorstep, because, like I said, it's a new administration with a new combination of a ruler elite for the country. It will not be one party only, and the days are over, for now at least, of one ruling party.
There are huge differences in policy orientation, particularly among the big political parties. What's the trick in finding common ground? President Ramaphosa talked about a common purpose when he spoke at the announcement of the results last week, Sunday. What is that trick in finding common purpose?
There's not a simple trick, I think, but the starting point at least has to be an agreement that we all as parties support the Constitution. I think that should be the starting point for all that are participating in the negotiations. If a party excludes itself by not adhering to the Constitution, and in fact saying it will ban the Constitution, it will get rid of it completely, then it means it automatically, as far as I can see, excludes itself from participation in a future government under this Constitution. So and I think that is the starting point, looking at who can participate, who should participate, by agreeing to the same principles embodied in the Constitution, particularly Chapter 1, and of course the Bill of Rights in Chapter 2. And once that is being agreed, and I believe that is not a difficulty, one should look at what are the factors that keep the parties together as far as co-government on the way forward is concerned. Again, I think there are issues that should be agreed upon right from the start, relating to foreign policy, to matters how the finances of the country has to be governed, and then also, I would say, defense and security policy. I think those 3 are very important aspects that should make out the start of the agenda. And then from there, more difficult issues, which the parties might differ on or have so far differed in their debates in Parliament. And I think that should be addressed one by one. as they go through them and see where differences lie so that it can be addressed in terms of finding answers. Or they can decide to say, okay, we differ on certain matters, and that will be the case. But it doesn't exclude.
You've already touched on South Africa being a constitutional democracy, and you have alluded to a party that simply says it does not believe in the current constitution of South Africa, and therefore it wants to hold a referendum with a view to scrapping that constitution. Well, that party, indeed, it does exist, and it has won big in this election. That's the MK party, led by former president now, Jacob Zuma. Does that baffle you, that a former head of state is leading a party whose messaging is around throwing out this constitution which he once swore to?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to understand or to answer, simply because, you know, the same person that you're referring to was part of the negotiations that led to the acceptance of that constitution, first through the interim constitution in 1994, and thereafter in 1996 when we negotiated the final constitution. He was very much part of the ANC at that stage, but also of the total body of negotiators that arrived at the adoption of the constitution. So it comes across very strange that his party now is stating in its manifesto before the election that it wants to get rid of the constitution, and that it doesn't believe in a constitutional democracy, that it doesn't believe the constitution is the supreme law of the land, and that it wants a state in which parliament is supreme. And my response to that was, you know, then we go back to apartheid times, because that is how it was under apartheid, where parliament and the executive was supreme, because we didn't have a fair constitution. There was, in fact, no constitution for all. And now he wants to go back to that state of affairs. I can't understand that, quite frankly. I don't know where that argument comes from.
So let's get into the room. Let's get into the theater of these discussions. You're going to have big personalities in there. Does it matter the temperament of the different individuals there? And how should they, you know, guide themselves or even guard against their own personal feelings? Because I'm sure there is going to be hot and cold temperatures.
Yeah, undoubtedly. You know, I noted that the parties have made their selection of their negotiating teams. It's not for us to respond with regard to who's been appointed, but I'm sure the leaders knew what they had to do in that regard. It's good, I think, that the leaders are not involving themselves directly in the negotiations. There should be a little bit of a distance there where they can keep themselves in the position of being principals, where they can, if necessary, be called in and negotiate with each other as party leaders, as principals, to find the solutions which the negotiators might not be able to get in the first instance. So the structure of the teams and so forth seemed to me from the outside to be a quite good choices, the way in which it's structured. And you know, one can expect them to have a hard time with each other over the next few days. Time is limited, so I hope they work 24 hours a day to come to the right results. It's a huge task on their hands. It's not about today and tomorrow and the swearing in of a new government in a few weeks from now. It's about the next 5 years. That is what voters expect of them. They must deliver on that mandate that the voters have given the different parties, and it's in the first instance to ensure that they attend to the national interest, and secondly, to ensure stability for the next 5 years, not for the next month or next year, but on a continuous basis for the next 5 years until there's the next election.
Yeah.
So it's a big task and responsibility that these negotiators have on their hands, and it's not about themselves. They must think country first, and I believe that is what they will do.
I'd like a practical example from you, but I'm going to ask you to do that in this way. You take us back to the CODESA days. It's you, the chief negotiator from the National Party. Cyril Ramaphosa is on the ANC's side. How did you manage the breaking points where the temperatures are so hot that you perhaps need to take a break? How did you handle those situations?
Well, you're absolutely right when you assume that there were moments where we were literally throwing the tables around and the chairs almost at each other. So those moments were there. And, I think what we realized as time went on, unfortunately, we had a period of time through which we could go through these exercises. But every time we had the opportunity to literally to sleep over the problem and come back the next day and look each other in the eye and say, okay, what about this? What about that? Can we look at the solution in this direction or in that direction? And, as it evolved, there's also a question of understanding that developed between us as individuals. Personally, I think relationships when it comes to negotiations are very important, and one has to rely on each other as human beings in those moments and respect each other, understand each other, and eventually also build trust in each other.
Yeah.
Under the current process, there's limited time. We all know they have to complete their task in 12 days from now to ensure that we have an elected president by that time. There will fortunately be more time to decide on the composition of the cabinet. But the reality is there's limited time now, and therefore I think the individuals involved must use their top skills and be decent with each other.
Yeah.
I think that is a very important requirement. We're all individuals that the Constitution says are equal in South Africa, and let us respect each other on that basis.
Recently, I had a conversation with former President Thabo Mbeki, and I put this question to him. In fact, we didn't know at that time that this would be the ultimate result. In fact, it was literally hours before the next day it would be election. And he said, there is no legislating over political matters. It simply will never work. Do you agree with him that there should not be a legally binding agreement around whatever coalition agreement is agreed upon, nor should there be any legal framework around a coalition government? What are your thoughts on that?
In essence, yes, I think President Mbeki is absolutely right when he said that. But one must also recall that we had the Government of National Unity, which was legislated through the interim constitution. It was for a limited period of time, initially intended, 5 years, but it had certain prescriptions contained in the interim constitution. So there was legislation about that. But under the current circumstances, there are no provisions that I'm aware of contained in any legislation. And so it will be a voluntary arrangement that the parties will have to come to. And it's not foreseen that it's going to be put in a bill or in a piece of legislation. It's not necessary for that. But the agreement one would expect, us as individuals, as citizens of the country, as the voting people of the country, would expect the parties to find binding agreements that can last, like I said earlier, for the next 5 years at least. We can't have changed agreements or adjustments or amendments to those agreements just month by month, because that will create instability and a lot of uncertainty. And we must remember it's us as the citizens of the country that's affected through that, but also people that would like to invest in South Africa and bring money into the investments of foreign direct investment into the country. And they have to rely, or they will have to rely on stability in the country, and that binding agreement should be part of that stability.
Yeah. That government, that 1994 government of national unity, do you remember how you decided on positions, who would hold what position in government? Because I think that is about to probably become a very big bone of contention.
Well, the provisions of the interim constitution was such that each party would get a number of seats in the cabinet, depending on the outcome of the election. And the 94 elections indicated thereafter that the ANC would have a certain number of cabinet positions, the National Party a certain number, and the IFP another quota of cabinet members. So the decision was very clear to be made in terms of the numbers. But as far as the individuals were concerned, it was up to the party leaders at the time who would occupy which seats. Of course, the party leaders had to agree amongst themselves which portfolios each party would be allocated. And there was an agreement between President Mandela and Deputy President de Klerk at the time, and also Chief Buthelezi as the party leaders, on which portfolios would be allocated to which party. And then the party leaders decided on the relevant individual that would occupy that particular position that was allocated, or cabinet post that was allocated. So that was the arrangement. I think under the current circumstances, again, if there are different parties that would agree to work together to form a cabinet, it would, I think, be advisable that the parties agree first on the numbers and then on the allocation of which portfolios. I don't think it can be prescribed by one party under such circumstances. There should be an agreement. It's part of the consensus. We must remember we're going to have a consensus government on the way forward, in one way or another. And therefore, consensus seeking is the rule of the game as we go forward from here.
Final question, and very briefly, if you can, let's then come to that sweet moment, the agreement. What was that ingredient, that secret ingredient that ultimately was seen as the breakthrough? Some people today will be very cynical about it and say the ANC simply compromised too much. What was that secret ingredient?
Yeah, I differ completely with that statement. I think there's sufficient proof. We go through the whole record of the proceedings and the negotiations that took place over a period of 6 years in total, from 1990 to 1996. It was hard bargaining all the time. But in the final instance, the constitution that we have today was agreed by the elected representatives of the people in 1996. It was the parliament composed of 400 members and acting as the Constitutional Assembly that voted on that constitution on the 8th of May 1996. And it was that body that actually finalized the constitution that we have today. So I think it's important that we keep that in mind, how the constitution came about and who were responsible for that. What made it possible to find that final agreement and there were lots of contestations on different topics. But I think the moment where, and I can recall this in my own experience, or through my own experience, where the moment where we agreed on what we want from the future instead of what we want to protect from the past was the defining moment for us to resolve the South African issue and to come about not only with a new constitution, but also an agreement that could last. And it lasted now for 30 years. And I think we can all be proud as South Africans of that. I came back yesterday from a conference in Sarajevo in Bosnia. And I listened there to representatives from a whole range of countries, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa region. For 3 days, I was just there as an observer, and I listened to all these representatives. And I came away with one conclusion, and that is, I am very happy that I'm a South African because we have a working democracy. And most of those that were present at that conference, unfortunately, couldn't say the same.
Roelf Meyer, thank you very much for your time, reflections, and indeed, word of advice on the talks